I think it's time now to hand over to our colleague, Justine Lacroix, who now has the very difficult task to try to wrap up these 2 days of intense reflection.
So, first, congratulations to Marie-Laure Basilien-Guinge for organizing such a fascinating workshop, which has combined perspectives coming from law, political science, sociology, and philosophy. Well, I'm deeply honored to deliver this conclusion, even though I'm afraid I find myself in the uncomfortable position of forcing you to listen to the 10th presentation of the day, when you are no doubt just dreaming of going out for a drink by the banks of the Rhone. So forgive me and be patient. So I've organized my conclusions around 2 questions that have been central to the entire conference. First, what has happened or what is still happening? And second, what can be done? So what has happened and what is still happening? Well, in his opening speech, Dan Cameron rightly insisted that the greatest threats to democratic value in the EU come from the inside, given the links between what he called the upside down and the right side up. And so this certainly remains true even after Orban's defeat. After all, we are in France, a country where there is a chance that a far-right candidate could become president next year. And even if he or she doesn't win, there are good reasons to remain concerned, since Léonie de Jong has demonstrated that ideas, once considered extreme, such as ethno-nationalist definitions of citizenship, have become increasingly prevalent in public discourse and policy making. And this echoes the paradox highlighted by Luca Tomini. While it is open, but not sure it's completely a good news anyway, but it is open that autocratization has reached a plateau at a global scale, the end of democratic immunity in consolidated democracies is the new worrying trend. Now, over the past 2 days, we also have learned a lot about how authoritarianism takes hold in practice. Julien Jeannenet showed that illiberal regimes do not destroy the constitutional order, rather they use legal power in ways that violate the spirit of constitutional restraint. And actually this constitutional arbor is very worrying in the long term, regardless of the results of future elections, because it changed the constitutional culture itself. And Julien Jeannenet's analysis was in line with that of Petra Barth, who has demonstrated how illiberal continue to govern within the law while evading all domestic and external constraints. And in these new patterns of governance, law itself becomes a tool for domination. Now, in addition to this global perspective, John Morin detailed how political subordination of the judiciary takes place in illiberal regimes. And the difficulty being, as he said, that you can't unscramble the eggs, and it's very difficult to restore the rule of law without breaking it again. And again, this echoes what Luca Tomini said. The major problem today is not so much prevention against, but exit from autocratization. And for her part, Marie Padilla showed how universities are targeted using methods which seem very similar to those employed against civil society, even though academic freedom is still not considered as crucial in public debates about democratic decline. Now, I have learned a lot from this presentation, which have deepened and complicated our understanding of the so-called de-democratization process. However, for the sake of discussion and future reflection, I would like to highlight what was perhaps missing from the picture. And firstly, it seems to me that it is important not to assume that the de-democratization process and the attacks on human rights began only in the 21st century, as it before the EU and its member states formed a virtuous community committed to the rule of law. And yet we all know the story. You know, in the early 2000s, we were supposed to be living in the age of rights, as human rights were the only political and moral concept to enjoy near universal endorsement. Not always in reality, of course, but at least in the political discourse. And since the fall of the Berlin Wall, human rights had become the global benchmark for political legitimacy. In 2000, the adoption of a Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union was intended to mark a new milestone in this process. And still in 2010, Samuel Moulin published an highly influential book in which he described human rights as our last utopia. Well, to be sure, this quick reminder illustrates the political and intellectual reversal that has taken place over the last 2 or 3 decades. However, while this narrative is certainly not entirely false, I would argue that it only tells part of a story. And here, I would like you to keep in mind what the philosopher Hannah Arendt wrote in 1951 in her famous chapter, The Decline of a Nation State and the End of the Rights of Man, in which she explores the situation of stateless persons in the period between the 2 world wars. And in that chapter, she showed that the act of stripping entire human groups of their legal rights was by no means a totalitarian invention. It had been foreshadowed by the very respectable European nation states' treatment of minorities and stateless persons after the First World War. And in the same vein, I would argue that the erosion, not to mention the massive attacks on rights that we have witnessed in recent years or months, do not come out of nowhere. These attacks have been brought about by the way we have a long time, and in some cases for nearly 50 years, treated those considered as being on the margins or even completely excluded from the legitimate political community. But the first group I have in mind are, of course, the migrants. Juliet Stumpf demonstrated the connection between the weakening of democracy and the rule of law for all citizens and the Trump administration's violation of foreigners' human rights. However, as Juliet is well aware, and that's the reason why she mentioned the pushback practice, these violations of human rights are not unique to illiberal regimes. And in reality, as demonstrated notably by Marie-Laure Basilien-Guinch's extensive work on this subject, it has been more than 25 years, at least since the Tampere Summit in 1999, that our so-called liberal democracies have established a comprehensive system of control and repression based on the systematization of detention, deportation, and outsourcing to states where human rights violations are systematic. So, in other words, long before we began to speak of illiberalism or de-democratization in certain European countries, or respectable European nation states also created the condition for the emergence of rightless people at the very heart of Europe. And you may recall that for Arendt, being rightless was not about being deprived of a particular right, but about being deprived of a place in the world that makes it possible to claim rights. Not the loss of specific rights, she wrote in 1951, but the loss of a community willing and able to guarantee any rights has been the calamity which has befallen ever-increasing number of people. Well, this loss of a community willing to guarantee a right to asylum is precisely maybe not the objective, but at least the consequences of the soft law agreements made by the EU with countries such as Turkey, Libya, Tunisia, and Sudan, or of the Return Directive of March 26, which aims to bypass the principle of non-refoulement. And as we all know, it's very unlikely that this policy will be modified regardless of current political developments. And even if the process of autocratization were to reach a plateau or begin to reverse in Europe, the election of Peter Major will change nothing in this regard. On migrations, he holds the same position as Orban. So I shall not dwell on this issue. There are plenty of people far more qualified than I am to speak on this matter, including at least two in this room. But I would like to focus on another group that is also considered to be on the margins of the political community, although for very different reasons. And curiously, this group attracts very little attention in academic and public debates about the state and the future of the rule of law. That group is that of prisoners. Here, and for this reason, I was very interested by the parallels made by Juliette between criminal law and migration. And here the trend is much older. Indeed, it was as early as the 1970s in Britain and the United States, and then in France from the 1980s onwards, that what sociologist Didier Fassin calls a punitive term took place. In Britain and the United States, it was particularly from the 1970s onwards that the so-called penal welfarism, which focused on prevention rather than punishment and rehabilitation rather than deterrence, was radically called into question. And it is, of course, in the United States that the shift has been most dramatic, as between 1970 and 2010, the number of prisoners were increased 7 or 8-fold, depending on the method of calculation. But we must keep in mind that even though they remain far below the peaks reached by the United States, most European democracies are currently experiencing this punitive moment. Between 2000 and 2003, the prison population has risen in 16 of the 27 EU member states, and often by very significant margins, as the proportion of population in prison has increased over the last 2 decades by 37% in Sweden, 33% in France, 34% in Hungary, 44% in Greece, and 136% in Croatia. And in fact, only 3 of the EU 27 member states combine low incarceration rates with a decline or stability in imprisonment over the last 2 decades: Germany, the Netherlands, and Finland. This is not a lot, especially given that we know that this rise in the prison population is not linked to an increase in the more serious form of violence. Furthermore, the irrational nature of this carceral approach is well documented. Its deterrent effect has never been proven, and its consequences in terms of social alienation and re-offending, and thus a lack of security for everyone, have long been established. So let me be clear, I'm not an abolitionist. There has never been a society without punishment, and I consider a penal state to be both normal and necessary. However, it seems to me that one of the key features of a truly liberal political community is that incarceration should be reduced to a minimum, and that conditions imposed on lawbreakers should never dehumanize them. Yet, what is striking for me as a political theorist is that this prison population increase since the 1970s has coincided with a near exclusive refocusing of the so-called liberal thought on distributive and institutional issues. Of course, distributive and institutional issues are very important, but it is as folk the academic and public debates on justice no concern only this distributive and institutional aspect. How do we allocate goods? How do we tax? How do we vote? How do we organize political powers? And no longer its corrective aspect. What do we punish? How do we punish? And this is surprising since, as we know, that political liberalism has been historically been built around two central issues, tolerance and punishment. Actually, the issue of excessive punishment and the rights of those brought before the courts was one of the driving forces behind the struggle against despotism before and during the French Revolution. In his illuminating presentation, Olivier Alexandre just showed the unexpected lineage or links between Montesquieu typology of political regimes and what is going on in the Silicon Valley and tech politics. Well, in 1748, in the spirit of laws, Montesquieu also argued that the freedom of citizens depended on the benevolence of laws relating to the punishment of crimes, whilst the severity in penalties was characteristic of despotic governments. Montesquieu added that it would be, quoting, "It would be easy to prove that in nearly all the states of Europe, penalties have decreased or increased in proportion one has moved closer to or away from liberty." However, today, even among those engaged in progressive causes, such as violence against women, this rise in incarceration is hardly a cause for mobilization, despite the fact that several European countries have already been condemned for their prison conditions, considered as inhuman and degrading treatment. And yet once again, as it is the case with migrants, the plight of those who have broken the law, who are suspected of having done so, should not be dissociated from the erosion of democracy and the rule of law we are witnessing. And in this regard, I would like to quote an article by Vincent Loy, a professor at Villanova University, written immediately after the murders of René Good and Alex Pretty. And what is really new, he writes, with what happens in the United States now in some place, is that violence that was once concealed and contained to spaces where the most marginalized live is now happening out in the open. Dynamics of oppression, which were once found only at the margin of US public culture, in the army or in the prison, which Vincent Lloyd knows very well, are now found in other places, but differently. It also concerns white middle-class people. And so it was the first point I wanted to make, the importance of not separating our overall assessment of the state of freedoms and democracy from the way in which most of our states, even those still classified by reports such as VDEM as liberal democracy, treat those on the margin, because this tells us maybe as much about the state and the future of public liberties as the analysis of political parties and institutions. Now, moving on to the second part of my conclusions. What can be done? Well, in the US, the Supreme Court won't save us. So Andesine stressed the importance of building a counter political discourse to try to win back the votes of the working and middle classes, and insisted on the necessity to focus on anti-corruption, on economic and social measure, and also on disinformation. Within the European Union, Laurent Peck set out some guiding principles and best practices that could address democratic backsliding, drawn from the case law of the European Court of Justice and the European Court of Human Rights. And it seems to be that he insisted that these principles should take into account the previous violation done to the Constitution and to the judiciary, and not only the stability imperative. Well, for my part, as I'm a political theorist, so what can political theory do? Well, but it seems to me that in the context of semantic confusion, political theory may play a modest role, very modest role, in clarifying the terms we use, as Jean-Yves Francher just did, with a few concepts such as populism, illiberalism, sovereignty. For my part, I would like to build on the paper presented by Thomas Hockman. Unfortunately, he's not there, but anyway. Thomas Hockman highlighted the misunderstandings and confusion surrounding freedom of expression, emphasizing that we should avoid the trap of neutrality that does not allow us to discriminate between a measure that seeks to defend democracy and a measure that aims to destroy it. In the same vein, I would like to emphasize that liberty should not be confused with a mere ability to choose, as if all choices were equal. In a recent and excellent book, The Age of Choice, the historian Sophia Rosenfeld shows how the idea that human autonomy, dignity, and personal fulfillment depends solely on the individual's ability to make choice has become established in the contemporary era. And Rosenfeld points out that the term choice actually does not appear anywhere in the 789 Declaration or in the 1781 Bill of Rights, which is a significant difference from the 1948 Universal Declaration, where it appears several times. Choice of residence, free choice of employment, choice of education for one children, etc. And Rosenfeld thus presents the 1948 Declaration as the culmination of a long intellectual, economic, and social evolution in which several transformations that had taken place since the 16th century, the multiplications of goods, the change in attitudes toward faith, the introduction of the voting votes, and so on, transformations that have established the idea that freedom and therefore the more value of human rights lies entirely in the capacity to choose and no longer in the capacity to make certain choices rather than others. However, reducing freedom to mere freedom of choice can have several perverse effects. First, it increases inequality. The focus on expressing preferences in your structural injustice related to gender, ethnicity, and above all, income and educational inequalities, meaning that many people are unable to make a real choice. Second, when rights are reduced to mere individual preferences, they no longer allow the consideration of collective issue, hence the risk that human rights turn against human rights. Thomas Hockman brought this up in relation to freedom of expression, but there are other examples, as the right to privacy. I have in mind the work of Bernard Harcourt, for instance. Whilst the right to privacy is listed in Article 8 of the European Convention as a fundamental right, more and more of us are abandoning the idea of an autonomous and inviolable private sphere in favor of a pragmatic view where everything can be bought and sold, including our private lives. And finally, equating freedom solely with freedom of choice makes it difficult to conceive of collective action in face of existential challenges such as climate change, which require limiting individuals' preferences, particularly those of the most privileged groups, in terms of consumption and transport. Otherwise, quoting Sophia Rosenfeld, the sum of our choice risks resulting in a world that nobody would choose. So there is a need to uncover an alternative way of understanding freedom. And of course, this is not about diminishing the importance of choice. It is simply a reminder that choice is not an end in itself, but a means to achieve freedom and equality for all. But of course, this also implies changing our current understanding of human rights. As Jean-Yves Francher has shown, today, all critics of human rights converge to depoliticize them. Human rights are not considered as principles with political effectiveness, constituting the founding of democracy. But it seems to me it's important to bear in mind that this narrow or individualistic view of human rights is prevalent even at the heart of our liberal legal system. As demonstrated in a recent book by Stéphanie Hennette-Vaucher and Antoine Vaucher, which analyzed the case law of the Conseil d'État and Conseil constitutionnel in France, human rights are frequently perceived, even by their proponents, as individual interests that must be balanced against the collective interest. Hence the necessity, and I think it has been said it has been repeated several times by Marie-Laure in her introduction also, the necessity for us to keep repeating that human rights do protect the collective interest insofar as they are the existential condition of a democratic society. Thank you.
I'm just jumping in order to express some thanks. First, thanks for our astonishing guest speakers who delivered stunning presentations for nourishing our thoughts. Thanks to the chairmen and women who deliver the difficult role of managing the time, like the masters of the clocks. Thanks for the audience, for the presence, and for the really deep questions you asked to our guest speakers. And of course, thanks to Liz and Yassine for the invisible but tremendously necessary work they have done during these few days. Thank you so much all, because it's because of you this was a success. Thank you. Ah oui,